Trump proudly says that he is tariff man. And he did do damage with tariffs in his first term. And he's, of course, threatening even more in the second term. And we've seen just over the weekend the trade brinksmanship that he engaged in with Canada and Mexico. And, of course, he also imposed and is threatening to impose tariffs on China and the European Union. And I can't really say anything nice, that there's no way of spinning it other than that Trump simply does not understand trade. He thinks a trade deficit means he is losing, or that America, the United States, is losing, and therefore he has to do something about it. My view on this has always been, well, every week in America, I have a trade deficit with my local grocery store. I'm always going up. I'm buying my Diet Coke from them. I'm buying my hamburgers. I'm buying all the the American things that we love to eat and drink. My local grocery store has never bought anything from me. So I have a giant trade deficit with my grocery store. Am I losing? Of course not. I benefit. I'm engaging in voluntary exchange, and by definition, I would not be buying my hamburgers and my Diet Coke if I wasn't benefiting. I give the grocery store little green pieces of paper, or actually little pieces of plastic now, since everything is done with credit cards and things like that. So I give a little piece of plastic, and I get these things that I like to eat and drink. And I have a giant trade deficit. It's not bad for me. Likewise, the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, where I work, they're always giving me money, not nearly as much as I want, but they're giving me money. And yeah, I write papers, I give speeches, I meet with policymakers, but I never buy things from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that trade deficits don't matter. And I want to give an example. Mark Perry, an economist at the American Enterprise Institute, put together this Venn diagram, and he does this all the time. This is sort of one of his signature moves in terms of being an economist working in public policy. The reason he put this together is, you may remember a week or so ago, I mean, it already seems like Trump's been president for 5 years, but it's only been a couple of weeks. About a week ago, Trump had this big thing about how he's going to welcome $500 billion, maybe $1 trillion of investment from the Middle East and elsewhere to finance artificial intelligence research and development in the United States. Okay, that's fine, but what he doesn't understand is that when you have foreign investment coming into the United States, in other words, if foreigners have dollars and those foreigners use their dollars to invest in the United States, guess what? They're not using those dollars to buy goods and services from the United States. And why is Trump being intellectually inconsistent? Let me show you this next slide. As an accounting identity, the flip side of a trade deficit is a capital surplus. Now let's think about this logically. I buy something from overseas. That person overseas now has dollars. There are two things that foreigner can do with those dollars. That foreigner can buy goods and services from the United States, or that foreigner can invest those dollars in the United States. And what we see here is that, by and large, foreigners, at least on the margin, they like investing in the United States. Now, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a sign of strength. If foreigners who have dollars decide, I want to invest in the U.S., isn't that a sign of strength? Do people want to invest where they're going to lose money? No. Do they want to invest where the economy's bad? No. They want to invest where they think they're going to build wealth and earn profits and generate interest and dividends and things like that. But what Trump doesn't understand is that this foreign investment surplus is the flip side of a trade deficit. Now, Trump seems to think, based on what he was doing just a week ago, he seems to think that you can have a foreign investment surplus and a trade surplus at the same time. You can't. It is literally impossible, because this is an accounting identity. Now, of course, logically, neither one of those two things matter. What you want in your economy is people in the private sector making millions of individual decisions on the basis of where do they want to buy goods and services and where do they want to invest their money. And it turns out, okay, in the U.S. historically, foreigners like investing. They also, we're one of the biggest exporters in the world, so we also, of course, have lots of foreigners buying goods and services, but in the aggregate, they tend to invest some of those dollars that they earn. Trump, I don't think, understands this at all. As I said before, I genuinely think that he believes you can have an investment surplus and a trade surplus at the same time. It's utterly impossible. And I don't think anyone is capable of changing his mind because he is, years ago, back in 2017 when he was first president, I was giving some speeches in New Zealand, and I said on a TV program, I said that Trump is like your uncle at a holiday dinner. He has lots of strong opinions, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Now, that doesn't make him a bad person. It doesn't make your uncle a bad person, but it's very unusual to have that kind of person as president of the United States. And so Trump has these strong opinions. Some of them I agree with, many of them I disagree with, but on trade, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And let me give you another example. He thinks that manufacturing in the United States has been destroyed by trade. Well, if you look at manufacturing as a share of GDP, it hasn't really changed. This is going all the way back to the end of World War II. Manufacturing as a share of GDP has stayed remarkably constant in the United States. But something has changed dramatically. The number of workers that it takes to produce that manufacturing value has dramatically declined. From more than 30%, because this goes back, of course, during World War II, we had a big spike because we had all these people building tanks and airplanes and things like that. But we used to have manufacturing employment of about 30% of the workforce, and now we're down under 10. Trump blames that on NAFTA and China, but look at when NAFTA and China came in. There was already this long-term decline, not because manufacturing value was being destroyed, but because there were such big increases in manufacturing productivity. The number of workers it takes to produce an automobile is much lower than it used to be because the technology, the robotics, the equipment is so much more sophisticated and productive today. And that's true across the board for all different types of manufacturing. So Trump thinks NAFTA and China are to blame, but nobody looking at this chart can think that's true. It had no effect on the slope of the curve. But again, politicians sometimes they're just genuinely not smart, and sometimes they're just being demagogic. I mean, as a politician, you might understand this chart, but when you're going out and giving a speech in a town that has a factory that's lost workers, you're probably going to just demagogue and say, oh, it's the fault of China, it's the fault of NAFTA, even though you know that's not true because politicians care about what more than anything else? They care about winning their elections, and sometimes that means they have to say things that are dishonest. They don't have to, but they think they have to. Let me show you some evidence from Trump's first term about the effects of his trade policy. There was a study that was just posted on the New York Federal Reserve Board, literally just about a week ago, and so I pulled out these charts from it. And what it shows, and again, you won't be able to read it, especially from the back, is that the purplish bar is the performance of companies on the days that Trump announced tariffs, and the blue line is on the days that Trump didn't announce tariffs. So you can see that there was a negative effect on investor expectations when Trump announced tariffs. Now, okay, that's investor expectations. So you might think, well, maybe the investors were just being pessimistic because they didn't understand that Trump was playing three-dimensional chess and that really good things were going to happen. And so the economists, the four economists who wrote this study, they then looked at, okay, for these companies that were negatively affected in this first chart, what were the actual results for these companies? And lo and behold, profits went down, employment went down, sales went down, and productivity went down. So pretty much everything that trade theory would tell you, I assume some of you have learned about comparative advantage and things like that, but you don't even have to have learned those things. Here's what I say when I'm speaking to American audiences. Is it good that we have free trade between Texas and California? Is it good that we have free trade between Illinois and New York and between New Jersey and Nebraska? Well, of course it's good. And we know that with that free trade, that sometimes over time factories will be more likely and headquarters will be more likely to be in different parts of the country. But we understand that inside America's border, that this trade has been good for us. So why does trade suddenly become bad simply because you draw a line on a map and instead of being state borders, it's now national borders? Logically, you always want to have private decision makers, private investors, private businesses, private consumers. You want them making the decisions about what is the best way of allocating their money. You'll get more economic efficiency, greater economic output. You want pluses. You don't want minuses when you're looking at profits, employment, sales, and productivity. And by and large, not having government interfere with private economic transactions is the best way of ensuring that you're going to have pluses, not minuses. But again, because countries have different trade policies, you wind up with some unfortunate policies. Now, one of the best economists in history when looking at trade was back in the 1840s, 1850s, Frederick Bastiat in France. And he said something that, the English wording is a little stilted, and so maybe it's sometimes hard even for a native English speaker to understand it. But I think it should be, if you think about it slowly. Trade protection accumulates upon a single point the good which it affects, while the evil inflicted is infused throughout the mass. The one strikes the eye at a first glance, while the other becomes perceptible only to close investigation. And what Bastiat is really saying there is that it's very easy with protectionism to see who wins. Oh, look, this factory making tires, it's still there. It's still employing people. As a matter of fact, after we put on the trade tax, they hired more people. It's very easy to see the winners from protectionism. What's hard to see, and this is what Bastiat is saying with that difficult quote, well, if tires are more expensive and the tariffs have made the economy less efficient, there are going to be more jobs lost in the overall economy than are gained at the tire factory. But we can't identify those jobs. We can identify, oh, tire prices are now 20% higher, but we don't know what that did to automobile manufacturing and sales employment. We don't know what that did because more money was having to be consumed buying tires. People had less to spend on everything else. We know there's damage elsewhere in the economy, and we know the aggregate damage is bigger. So in other words, you might get this much benefit in the tire industry, but you'll have this much cost elsewhere in the economy, but it's hard to identify those costs. It's easy to identify, oh, we have 3,000 more people working in that tire factory or something like that. Bastiat has a very famous quote about a good economist is one who sees the seen and the unseen. A bad economist is just the one who sees the obvious thing. Again, what's the obvious thing in this example? The more workers working at the tire factory. But Bastiat is saying you have to look at the bigger negative effect. I want to show you a chart that I share with American audiences. If you look at economic freedom of the world from the Fraser Institute, they measure. Remember at the beginning I had that slide with the 5 major policies: trade policy, regulatory policy, so on and so forth. Well, you can look at the Fraser Institute's economic freedom of the world and look at the country that have the worst scores for trade and which countries are the most free trade. And you can see on the right are the most free trade jurisdictions in the world. As of 2 years ago, I think I did this. And these are the most protectionist nations in the world. What's the difference between the two? Well, the average per capita GDP of the protectionist countries is only $3,200. the average per capita GDP of the free trade nations is more than 46,000. Now, I want to be fair. There are lots of reasons why the countries on the right have higher per capita GDP. They have lower taxes, smaller government, better rule of law. So anytime you're looking at economic variables, you want to keep in mind that there are probably a lot of things that are going into producing a certain number. But is there any doubt that the protectionism is having a negative effect on these countries and the free trade on the countries on the right is helping them grow faster? Now, in the US, under Trump, we do have this sort of burgeoning group of people who are trying to justify and rationalize, oh, well, we can't really have pure free trade. And I want to address some of these issues. The potential exceptions to free trade orthodoxy. Maybe to some extent there's some legitimacy here. For instance, the very first thing that I have on the list, this comes up all the time when people are talking about trade with China. Well, maybe China's our enemy. So maybe we shouldn't be selling them very advanced computer technology. And obviously you don't want to sell them advanced fighter jets and stuff like that. So if you have a country that's a potential geopolitical adversary, I mean, think about, should England have had free trade with Germany in 1935? Well, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe that was not the right idea. So when you're talking about foreign policy and potential geopolitical conflict, maybe there are exceptions to free trade orthodoxy. And then, of course, here's another example that comes up with China all the time. China does subsidize their domestic producers. They have a very corrupt system of industrial policy. And then the question becomes, what should the United States, or for that matter, Mexico or any other country do? If China's going to subsidize their AI sector or their automobile sector, they're doing this extensively with electric vehicles and stuff like that, do you just sort of say, if China wants to subsidize foreign consumption, is that a bad thing? And economists like Milton Friedman, a great economist, said, look, if other countries want to subsidize our consumers, we should say thank you very much. Well, that's certainly, yes, a possible response, but if by subsidizing their AI and subsidizing their electric vehicles, they're causing a distortion in the world economy, and maybe you want to use the WTO or something like that to try to penalize China for causing that distortion in the world economy. It's an open question where pro-free trade people are on both sides of how you respond to another country subsidizing their exports. And then, of course, again, also related to China, all these things have come up in the last 10 years because there's been a big shift in the United States about how people perceive China. 10 years ago, and especially 20 years ago, the idea was China's going to liberalize their economy. They're going to become a normal country. Let's encourage them. Let's bring them in the WTO. Let's give them most favored nation trade status. And now there's a lot more skepticism about China. And so all these arguments come up. And to be honest, I don't know that we know the right answer, because in 1935, maybe Germany wasn't going to become the horrible country it became. But we don't know what's going to happen with China. We know what happened with Germany. We don't know what's going to happen with China. And so maybe you need an industrial base for defense manufacturing. I don't know, but these are the arguments that are coming up. But you know what? They're all specific to China, or maybe Russia also. And what I tell Republicans on Capitol Hill, because they're the ones I tend to deal with the most, is I say, look, if you're going to make an argument that we have to have restrictive trade practices for these reasons with China, there's no reason to have those policies restricting trade with Mexico or with the European Union or with South Africa or with India. So in other words, if you're going to have some special restrictions on trade because of China, make sure those only apply to China and not to other countries around the world.